This is Pastor Wilkins of Chasing Our History. Pastor Wilkins of Chasing Our History. I am on the property of George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. I'm on the property of George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. And we have found an historical slave graveyard. Right here is probably the youngest slave on this plantation. Right here, it's a small grave less than 2 feet long. We also see other graves out here on this plantation. Understand that when they pulled these graves up, they put markings down, and some of them you have to look real close at the string where the archaeologists have literally marked these graves. Again, I'm Pastor Wilkins of Chasing Our History. I am on the property of the first president of the United States of America, George Washington, and I am standing in a slave graveyard. I'm literally standing where your ancestors are buried, even as I speak. A grave at the tree. We see graves everywhere out here. They say there's 90. I've researched it as a historian. I found maybe 70 out here. I haven't found 90, but there's at least 70 graves of your ancestors, slaves, on this plantation. It is the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. You're standing in a slave graveyard. So far, I've counted maybe 20 graves. I see markings that would point to slaves being in the ground, according to research. Clearly, there are slaves in the ground out here on this property. Again, this is the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. We are standing on his plantation, and right now we are literally standing in a slave graveyard at Mount Vernon, right outside of Washington, D.C. As you see, they have monuments here to honor the slaves, but you need to understand the slaves are literally in the ground out here at Mount Vernon. And as you come up here, you start seeing other graves that are marked, slave graves marked out here at Mount Vernon. Less than 100 feet from here is the grave of the first president of the United States of America himself, George Washington. They have marked these graves right here. You see the markings that the graves have been marked. Here's another small grave. This would have to have been a child. This grave is less than 2 feet long. That would have had to have been a child's grave. I come over here and I see other graves that are marked. You see how the archaeologists have marked all these graves out in this graveyard. If you look real close, there's the string where they marked it off. There's the nails where they marked it off. These are graves. These are the graves of your ancestors. Here's the grave at the tree. According to research, you will find graves at a tree that symbolize their graves. Here's another grave right here. We are at Mount Vernon, the first president of the United States of America. I am standing literally in a slave graveyard on his plantation right here in Mount Vernon, right outside of Washington, D.C. And as you can see, slave graves are everywhere out here in this graveyard. Again, I'm Pastor Wilkins of Chasing Our History. As you can see, slave graves are everywhere out here in this graveyard. You have two sections of this where these slave graves would literally be. Here's a memorial to the slaves. And then on both sides of this memorial, you find slave graves. All throughout here, you find slave graves in this cemetery. Over here is a plaque honoring them. Over here is a plaque that would honor them. This is the slave cemetery right out here at Mount Vernon outside of Washington, D.C. at the first president of the United States. This is his estate. It is huge. The estate is huge. There's a water backdrop. Looks like a lake that's behind the plantation. But the plantation is enormous. This area here is to honor the slaves that were on his property. This is Mount Vernon, the president of the United States, the first president of the United States of America. I'm going to take you back in. I'll go back in again and I'll show you some of these graves that the archaeologists have clearly marked. Clearly they've been marked by the archaeologists. When I did my research for history, I was able to come up with like 90 of them. But out here, I think I found maybe 70 at best. But they are definitely out here. We're on the other side of the slave graveyard. Pastor Wilkins, chasing our history. We are on the other side of the slave graveyard. All this is the slave burials. All this that you see. The first president of the United States of America, George Washington. We are on his plantation even as we speak. I told you this would be a big week for chasing our history. It don't get no bigger than George Washington himself. Look how the graves are marked off. Look at that. You see the grave is clearly marked off. Look at that. That's the marking of the grave. The archaeologists have clearly come out here. They found these slave graves and they marked them. Here's another one. They're all out here. These are slaves in the ground. These are slaves in the ground. The slave graveyard. Look at that. You are standing at the plantation of George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. Now I'm going to walk you around to George Washington's tomb as I come off the other side of this graveyard. Those graves are lightly marked. Y'all might want to watch for those strings out there. Now I'm going to stand on the other side of this tomb. Pastor Wilkins of Chasing Our History. Again, we are in a historical slave graveyard. Again, here's the plaque that honors these slaves. These are the slaves of the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. And then you come in here and you see even babies are in this graveyard. You come through here and you start seeing them being marked off. Right here where this watery area is, this is a grave of a baby, and it's less than 2 feet long. It's less than 1 foot wide. Clearly an infant or a baby slave is in that grave. If you come here, you find other graves of these slaves that are out here in this graveyard. Again, New York Times has been out here. The historians have been out here. The archaeologists have come out here and they tested this ground. They ran their samples and they found these bodies in the ground right here. This is what you're looking at. Pastor Wilkins of the Image of God Ministry, Chasing Our History. You're standing in a slave graveyard. 90 graves, according to research, is supposed to be out here. I think I found about 70 of the 90 graves in this area. I haven't found all 90. And there's at least 11 children that's out here. I've only found 3 children. But this is Mount Vernon, the first president of the United States of America. You are standing on his property right now, his plantation, Mount Vernon. Here's a plaque letting you know that you are in a slave cemetery. Here's a plaque over here that honors these slaves. There are actual slaves in this ground. According to research, these slaves are out here in this ground. Here's a plaque that honors them. Clearly the archaeologists have done their research and they found these graves. This is a slave graveyard. Probably the greatest slave graveyard in America is sitting on the plantation of the first president of the United States of America, a slave graveyard. Now I'm going to walk you up to the tomb of the first president of the United States of America. So bear with me as we go up this sidewalk. This plantation is huge. It is absolutely huge. There's a line up here waiting to see the tombs, but we're walking now towards the tomb of the first president of the United States of America. As we come up on it, again, George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. You are literally on his plantation as I film. And we just left the slave graveyard. The archaeologists have clearly found 70 to 90 graves in that area. This is the tomb of the general himself, the first president of the United States of America. Again, this is Pastor Wilkins of Chasing Our History. This is the actual tomb of the first president of the United States of America. That's him. He's laying right there in that tomb. The first president of the United States of America, George Washington. We are on his estate, Mount Vernon. This is a plantation. This is Mount Vernon, the first president of the States of America. There it is, the tomb of George Washington. There it is. You are standing at Mount Vernon, right outside of Washington, D.C. The plantation is immaculate. It is absolutely immaculate out here. Look at this. I'm now headed towards the mansion of the first president of the United States of America. I will put pictures up when I get up there. Shalom, shalom. Amen.